"Don't go in there, sir." The voice was small, but it cut through the polished hallway so cleanly that even the soft hydraulic whisper of the boardroom doors seemed to stop halfway shut. Jonathan Hale turned, one hand still on the brushed steel handle, his reflection split across the tall glass wall beside him. For a second, nobody moved. Not the executives in tailored navy suits. Not the assistant balancing a leather folder against her chest. Not the security guard standing near the elevator with his earpiece, catching the cold white light. Every eye slid toward the same impossible interruption. A little black girl stood 10 feet away in worn white sneakers, denim leggings, and a faded purple hoodie zipped over a school t-shirt. She could not have been older than 9. One of her braids had come loose near the end, and the frayed strap of her backpack dug into one shoulder like she had been carrying too much for too long. But it wasn't her clothes that held the hallway hostage. It was the look on her face. She wasn't crying. She wasn't lost. She looked like someone who had already decided that being ignored was more dangerous than being wrong. Jonathan's brow tightened. The air around him always carried the pressure of movement, the sense that meetings started when he entered and fortunes shifted when he sat down. Men twice her age usually stepped out of his way before he even looked at them. Yet this child had planted herself between him and the most important board meeting of the quarter, as if she had a right to stop time. Margaret Sloane recovered first. "Naomi," she hissed under her breath, color rushing into her face as she hurried forward on sharp heels. "What are you doing? Move, sweetheart. Right now." But Naomi didn't move. Her fingers were wrapped around a crumpled sheet of paper, the corners bent and softened from being held too tightly. Jonathan's gaze dropped to it, then back to her face. The elevator behind them dinged once, bright and out of place in the silence. Somewhere farther down the hall, a copier spat out a page and went still again. "Sir, I'm sorry," Margaret said quickly, already reaching for the girl's shoulder. "She's Denise Carter's daughter. Housekeeping brought her in because school's closed today. It won't happen again." Housekeeping. Jonathan knew the word the way people know the hum of an appliance in a room they never really look at. Necessary. Constant. Invisible. He had passed the night crews and cleaning carts for years without learning more than the smell of lemon polish lingering after they were gone. Now one of their children was standing in front of him, and the annoyance that rose in his chest came with something else he disliked even more: curiosity. Naomi lifted her chin. Her eyes were dark and steady, too steady for a little girl cornered by adults in a 42nd floor executive corridor lined with imported marble and framed stock certificates. "They changed the numbers after midnight," she said. No tremor, no stammer, just the sentence landing flat and hard between them. A low chuckle slipped from somewhere behind Jonathan, brief and dismissive. "Richard Voss." Jonathan didn't need to look to know the sound. Richard had a laugh made for closed-door negotiations, polished enough to sound harmless and sharp enough to make a person feel smaller for speaking. "That's creative," Richard said, stepping forward with a smile that showed all the right teeth and none of the right warmth. "But I think Mr. Hale has a meeting to attend." Naomi's hand tightened around the paper until it crackled. "The cancer trial losses are hidden in the gray appendix," she said, this time looking directly at Jonathan. "If you go in there now, you'll be reading the wrong version." That did it. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Jonathan felt it first in his jaw. The words were too precise, too clean. The trial losses were confidential, known only to legal, 2 board members, and the handful of senior staff who had spent the past 72 hours trying to keep the market from smelling blood. There was no reason a 9-year-old girl in scuffed sneakers should know anything about them. Richard's smile stayed on his face half a beat too long. Margaret stopped reaching for Naomi. Even the security guard shifted his weight. Jonathan turned fully now, leaving the boardroom door ajar behind him. His reflection in the glass looked sharper than he felt. "What did you say?" he asked. Naomi swallowed, and for the first time he saw the child inside the courage. Her throat moved. Her fingers trembled. But her voice held. "I said they moved the losses so you wouldn't see them before the vote." The fluorescent lights overhead cast a cool shine over the floor, turning the marble into a sheet of frozen water. Jonathan took one slow step toward her. "Who told you that?" Naomi shook her head. "Nobody told me. I heard Mr. Voss say the numbers were safer in the appendix. Then the printer jammed in the copy room, and this page got left behind." She held out the paper. It looked tiny in her hand, just one wrinkled sheet against a corridor built for power and speed, and men who never expected to be interrupted by truth in a child's voice. Jonathan took it. The page was warm from her grip. At the bottom right corner, beneath the revised financial table, the timestamp sat in small black type like a match waiting to be struck, 12:43 a.m. He scanned the line items once, then again, and something in his face went still. When he finally looked up, Richard Voss was no longer smiling. Jonathan Hale had spent 22 years building a company that could survive lawsuits, market swings, bad press, and the slow greed of men in expensive suits. But standing in that hallway with a wrinkled page in his hand, he felt something far more dangerous than panic. He felt uncertainty. His eyes moved over the timestamp again. 12:43 a.m. The revised table was real. The losses had been shifted into a section that would not appear in the executive summary packet unless someone went looking for it line by line. It was subtle, polished, almost elegant in the way only a deliberate deception could be. Around him, no one spoke. The boardroom door remained half open behind his shoulder, and from inside came the faint scent of coffee, leather, and climate-controlled air, as if the room itself was still waiting for him to enter and bless whatever version of reality had been prepared in his absence. Naomi stood where she had been standing, chin lifted, breathing carefully through parted lips. Up close, she looked even younger now that the shock had settled over the corridor. Her backpack was too big for her narrow frame. One of the cartoon patches on the front pocket had begun to peel at the corners. There was a pencil mark on the cuff of her sleeve, and a tiny smear of what looked like blueberry yogurt near the zipper. She should have been in a school cafeteria or at a library table swinging her feet under a chair. Instead, she was standing in the executive wing of Hale Biotech while grown men stared at her like she had just pulled the fire alarm in a cathedral. Jonathan lowered the page slowly. "Margaret," he said, not loudly, but the sound landed with enough force to make her straighten. "Get Helen Brooks. Now." Margaret blinked once, then reached for her phone. "Jonathan, the board is already seated," Richard Voss said, his tone warm with practiced reason. "This is obviously some kind of misunderstanding. We do not need to derail the morning because a child found an old printout near a copier." Jonathan turned his head just enough to look at him, and the silence that followed was colder than anger. Richard's expression stayed composed, but a tiny shine had appeared along his temple near the hairline. "An old printout would not carry a timestamp from 7 hours ago," Jonathan said. "And an old printout would not contain an appendix reference that was supposed to remain buried until legal framing." Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. Naomi looked from one man to the other, not with triumph, but with the alert stillness of a child trying to decide whether the danger had passed or only changed shape. The security guard by the elevator took another half step back, suddenly aware that the problem in front of him was far above his pay grade. Margaret's voice was low and urgent as she spoke into her phone. "Helen, come to the executive corridor right now. Bring the final packet." "No, right now." Jonathan glanced down at Naomi again. "How did you know this was important?" he asked. For the first time since she had spoken, Naomi's eyes flickered away from his face. She looked at the polished floor, at her own small white sneakers mirrored in marble, so glossy it seemed unreal. "Because of the way they said it," she answered. Like they were trying to hide something, but they thought nobody listening mattered. The words landed harder than Jonathan expected. He had heard versions of brilliance his whole life from analysts, founders, investors, politicians, journalists. But truth, when it arrived without polish, had a way of skipping the mind and going straight for the part of a man he usually kept behind locked doors. "Who said it?" Jonathan asked. Naomi hesitated. Her fingers found the loose thread on her backpack strap. "Mr. Voss," she said quietly, "and another man I did not know. They were near the copy room by the pantry. He said you never read the gray appendix before votes because you trust the room too much." The color in Richard's face changed so slightly that most people would have missed it. Jonathan did not. He had built his career on small shifts. He knew the difference between surprise and exposure, between offense and calculation. Richard gave a short laugh that failed to sound effortless. "This is absurd. We are taking corporate governance notes from a 9-year-old because she overheard fragments she could not possibly understand." Naomi looked up at that. The hurt crossed her face quickly, but it did not stay. What replaced it was something steadier. I understand numbers, she said. And I understand when adults act like they are safe because they think certain people do not count. The hallway went still again. Helen Brooks appeared at the far end a few seconds later, walking fast in a charcoal suit with her tablet tucked under one arm. She was usually unshakable, but one glance at Jonathan's face and then at the paper in his hand tightened her posture. What happened? She asked. Jonathan handed her the page. Compare this to the final board packet. Helen scanned the printout, then opened the digital file on her tablet. Naomi watched her thumb move, screen reflecting in the lenses of her glasses. Richard folded his arms. Margaret stood beside the wall with her phone at her side now, saying nothing. The sound of the building seemed to pull away from them. No elevator. No footsteps. No distant chatter from reception. Only the soft tap of Helen's nails against the tablet case and the whisper of conditioned air moving through hidden vents. Jonathan looked past the glass wall to the city below. 40 stories down, traffic moved like patient blood through the streets, yellow cabs and black SUVs sliding between intersections in the early Manhattan light. So much of power depended on timing. 5 more minutes, and he would have been inside. 10 more, and the vote would have started. 15 more, and the room would have boxed him in with summaries, confidence, and momentum. Helen stopped tapping. She looked up first at Jonathan, then at Richard, and all the color drained from her professional calm. The appendix was re-indexed, she said. The loss table was moved, relabeled, and partially netted against projected licensing gains. The board version and the legal archive do not match. Nobody breathed. Naomi's shoulders dropped by half an inch, not in relief exactly, but in the exhausted way a child lets go only after adults finally catch up to what she has been carrying alone. Jonathan did not look at Richard this time. He kept his eyes on Helen. Lock the meeting, he said. No one enters. No one leaves. Pull the server logs, printer records, and revision history from midnight forward. Then he turned to Naomi, the little girl in the faded hoodie who had stopped a billion-dollar mistake with a crumpled page and the courage to be inconvenient. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed. You said they thought nobody listening mattered. Tell me everything you heard. Naomi did not answer right away. The question seemed to settle over her shoulders with a weight that made her look smaller than she had 1 minute earlier. Jonathan saw it then, the strange split inside her that he had missed at first. She had the eyes of a child who still liked stickers and sweet cereal and cartoons before school, but there was something older in the way she measured adults before speaking, as if experience had already taught her that truth alone was never enough. You had to decide who could survive hearing it. Helen Brooks lowered her tablet, just slightly, waiting. Margaret Sloane stood near the wall with one hand pressed against her own wrist, the way people did when they were trying to stay composed without moving too much. Richard Voss had gone very still. Not calm. Still. It was the kind of stillness men wore when they were searching every corner of a room for the version of events they could still control. Naomi looked down at the floor again. The marble reflected the overhead lights in long pale bars that made everything feel colder than it was. My mom told me to stay in the pantry, she said softly. She was cleaning the North Conference rooms, and I was doing math on the little round table by the coffee machine. I was not trying to listen. I just heard them because they were not whispering. Jonathan said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence, used carefully, could pull more honesty out of a room than force ever could. Naomi licked her lips. Mr. Voss was standing by the copy room with another man. He had on a blue tie with tiny white dots. I remember because it looked like the one on the man from the cereal commercial my grandma likes. The detail would have sounded almost absurd in any other setting, but it only made her more credible now. Children did not remember situations the way adults wanted them to. They remembered the strange, true things no liar would think to invent. The other man asked if the file had been replaced. Naomi continued. Mr. Voss said, not replaced. Protected. Jonathan only reads what the room points to, and nobody points to gray appendices before a vote. Then he laughed. Not loud. Just like he already knew it would work. Richard shifted. This is ridiculous, he said. We are building a criminal theory out of a child's overheard misunderstanding and a paperwork discrepancy. Helen did not even look at him. She was already opening another secure file on her tablet, her fingers moving faster now. Naomi glanced toward Richard, and her small hand drifted to the backpack strap again. Jonathan noticed the motion. Fear was finally catching up to courage. It always did. He stepped half an inch to the side, not enough for anyone else to register as meaningful, but enough to place himself between Naomi and the direct line of Richard's stare. "Go on," he said, and this time his voice was lower, steadier, meant for her and not the room. Naomi took a breath. Then the printer near the pantry made that grinding sound it makes when too many pages come out at once. The other man got annoyed and said someone should clear it before staff saw anything. Mr. Voss said it did not matter because nobody on this floor reads what they clean around. The words settled over the corridor like dust after a shelf had been disturbed. Margaret closed her eyes for 1 second. Helen's jaw tightened. Jonathan felt something colder than corporate anger move through him. Not because the insult was dramatic. It was not. Men in boardrooms said worse things in cleaner language every day. No, what made it ugly was how ordinary it sounded. How practiced. How easy. Like contempt had become part of the air conditioning in places like this, always running, rarely noticed by the people who benefited from it. Naomi kept speaking, quieter now, as if once the memory opened it had its own momentum. Then my mom called my name from down the hall, so I went to get my backpack. But when I passed the printer, there was 1 page on the floor. Just one. I picked it up because I thought maybe it was important and somebody would come back for it. I saw the numbers first because there was a big red negative sign, and then I saw the timestamp in the corner. I know what a timestamp is because our school library prints one on every checkout slip. She looked at Jonathan then, and for the first time there was a child's uncertainty fully visible in her face. I did not understand all the words, but I knew people do not hide good news in extra pages. No one in the hallway argued with that. Even Richard knew better than to laugh now. Jonathan held the wrinkled sheet more carefully than before, like the paper itself had gained weight. He thought of the years spent building systems, teams, protocols, layers of review meant to make betrayal difficult and error visible. And yet, this morning the clearest set of eyes in his building had belonged not to a board member, not to a vice president, not to the legal department, but to a 9-year-old girl sitting near a coffee station with a math worksheet in her backpack. Helen looked up from her screen. The server log confirms a late reclassification request at 12:38 a.m. submitted under delegated credentials. The archive version was accessed from Richard's office subnet. Richard gave a thin exhale, halfway between disbelief and outrage. Delegated credentials mean nothing. Half this floor works through proxies. That proves access, not intent. Jonathan turned at last to face him fully. "Intent is what children hear when adults think they are alone," he said. Richard opened his mouth, but whatever he had prepared did not survive the look in Jonathan's eyes. Naomi shifted her weight in her sneakers, and the movement drew his attention back to her. She looked tired now, not sleepy, worn down in that quiet way. Children sometimes did when they had spent too much energy being brave in rooms built for people bigger than they were. He noticed the folded edge of a worksheet peeking from her backpack. Fractions. Pencil answers. A purple star sticker near the top corner. Life waiting paused. "Where is your mother now?" Jonathan asked. Naomi's face changed immediately. The calm thinned. "She is on 41, she said, cleaning the investor lounge. "She does not know I came up here. She told me to stay put." Margaret inhaled softly. Everyone in the hallway understood what Naomi understood too. Denise Carter had sent her daughter to wait quietly and get through the morning without trouble, because for people in jobs like hers, trouble did not have to be your fault to become your burden. Jonathan looked once toward the neat rows on dark walnut shelves. A model of the company's first lab campus rested under glass near a stack of market reports no one had touched that day. Naomi stood just inside the doorway, her backpack still on, eyes moving from the wide desk to the city beyond it, then back to the carpet beneath her shoes as if she were not sure where she was allowed to look. Jonathan noticed she never wandered in her gaze the way most children would. She measured space the way her mother probably had taught her to, quietly, carefully, without leaving fingerprints. Margaret guided Denise Carter into the office less than a minute later. Denise entered breathless, one latex glove still tucked into the pocket of her gray housekeeping apron, the other clutched in her hand like she had pulled it off while hurrying to the elevator. Her eyes went straight to Naomi. Fear arrived before words did. "Naomi," she said, the name leaving her mouth in a tight whisper, full of warning and relief and dread all at once. "Baby, what happened?" Naomi turned toward her mother, And for the first time since stopping Jonathan in the hallway, she looked exactly 9. The steadiness softened. Her shoulders dipped. She took one small step forward. "Mama, I am sorry," she said. "I tried to stay put, but they changed something important, and I thought he needed to know." Denise closed her eyes for a second. Not because she did not believe her daughter. Jonathan could see that immediately. No, it was the look of a woman who had spent too many years understanding that truth did not always protect the people who spoke it. She took Naomi's hand, then looked up at Jonathan with the kind of caution that had been earned, not imagined. "Sir, if she caused a disruption, that is on me," Denise said. "I brought her in because her school is closed for teacher training and my sister could not watch her till noon. She knows better than to interfere. I am very sorry." Jonathan had heard apologies from senators, regulators, board members, startup founders, men with more money than cities, and women with enough influence to erase reputations before lunch. Denise's apology sounded different from all of them. It did not ask for forgiveness. It asked for survival. He looked at the glove in her hand, the faint smell of glass cleaner trailing in with her, the way she kept one foot slightly behind the other like she was ready to leave the instant she was dismissed. Naomi glanced up at her mother and squeezed her fingers. "You are not in trouble," Jonathan said. Denise blinked once, as if the sentence had not reached her correctly. He repeated it. "Neither of you is in trouble." The room stayed quiet after that, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the sharp silence of accusation. It was the uncertain silence that came when people who had braced for harm found none and did not yet know where to place their guard. Helen Brooks entered behind Margaret with a slim folder and shut the door softly. "Information security has frozen all outbound transfers linked to the executive floor," she said. "And we have confirmation that the packet revision trail was masked through delegated legal review." It was sophisticated, but not enough. Jonathan nodded once. Denise looked from Helen to Margaret to the city beyond the glass, and then finally to Naomi again, trying to understand what room she had stepped into and what storm her daughter had somehow walked through. Naomi found a page that should never have been left behind, Jonathan said. She heard a conversation that should never have happened in front of her. Because she spoke up, a manipulated board packet was caught before the meeting began. Denise stared at him. The words seemed too large to fit inside the narrow space where the morning had begun for her, pushing a cleaning cart past people who never asked her name. "She what?" Naomi's voice was small now. "I only told the truth, Mama." Denise turned fully to her daughter. Her face held pride, fear, and heartbreak in such equal measure that Jonathan had to look away for a second. It struck him then with surprising force that little girls like Naomi were not born cautious. The world taught them. It taught them when to go quiet, when to lower their eyes, when to make themselves easy to forgive for simply taking up space. And yet somehow, this child had done the opposite in the one moment that mattered most. Denise crouched a little so she could look Naomi in the face. "Did anyone talk to you wrong?" she asked gently. "Did anybody make you feel scared?" Naomi hesitated, then shook her head once. Jonathan caught the half-truth in that motion. Not because she was dishonest, but because children often protected their parents by shrinking their own hurt into something manageable. He knew there had been laughter in that hallway. He knew there had been dismissal. He knew exactly what kind of tone had been used when someone called her the housekeeper's daughter, as if that explained why her voice should not count. Helen set the slim folder on Jonathan's desk. On top was a printout of server access logs, clean black text on heavy white paper. Numbers, times, permissions. The modern fingerprints of betrayal. Jonathan did not open it yet. His eyes stayed on Naomi. "When you came to stop me," he said, "why did you do it yourself? Why not bring the page to your mother first?" Naomi looked down at the carpet. It was thick and dark and probably softer than any rug in her apartment. She rubbed her thumb against the edge of her backpack strap before answering. "Because by the time I found her, you would already be inside," she said. "And because grown-ups do this thing where if a kid says something scary, they tell you to wait. But some things are not wait things." No one in the room moved. The sentence was too simple to argue with and too honest to soften. Margaret slowly looked away toward the windows. Helen pressed her lips together. Denise inhaled sharply through her nose, the kind of breath a person takes when they are trying not to cry in a place where crying has never felt safe. Jonathan felt the truth of Naomi's words settle into the room with embarrassing precision. Wait was the language of power. Wait your turn. Wait outside. Wait for a better moment. Wait until someone important confirms what you already know. How many disasters in his company had arrived dressed as delays everyone called reasonable. He stepped out from behind his desk then, not as a performance and not for effect, but because sitting above Naomi suddenly felt wrong. He came down to her eye level the way decent adults do when they remember children are people before they are problems. You were right not to wait, he said. Naomi lifted her eyes to his, uncertain but listening. And from this moment on, nobody in this building gets to make you feel like telling the truth was a mistake. The room did not get softer after that. It got quieter. There was a difference. Softness invited comfort. Quiet invited truth, and truth had a way of making expensive offices feel suddenly small. Jonathan rose slowly, straightening to his full height again, but something in the posture had changed. The authority was still there, sharp as ever, yet it no longer felt like a wall. Naomi noticed it even if she could not have named it. Grown-ups usually got taller when they were upset. He had gone lower to speak to her, and now when he stood again, the room did not feel as frightening as before. Denise kept one hand on Naomi's shoulder, as if reminding herself that her daughter was still right there and had not been swallowed by the strange machinery of corporate trouble. Her other hand held the crumpled latex glove so tightly the powder at the wrist had left a pale mark on her palm. Jonathan turned toward his desk and finally opened the slim folder Helen had placed there. Access logs, revision timestamps, device signatures. The language of modern deception was cold and boring to anyone outside the system, but to him it read like a heartbeat gone wrong. He scanned one page, then another, then looked up at Helen. How clean is it? He asked. Helen did not pretend to misunderstand. Clean enough to show intention, she said. The appendix reclassification was not a clerical error. It was layered through delegated review, then mirrored to appear routine. Whoever did it expected the board to move fast and trust the summary packet. Jonathan's eyes shifted, almost lazily, toward the closed office door, as though he could still see Richard Voss standing somewhere beyond it in the executive corridor, waiting for the next lie to become useful. Expected me to move fast, he said. Helen gave a small nod. Yes. Denise listened without speaking, but Naomi could feel the tension in her mother's hand. It was not the content that scared her. It was the setting. People like Denise Carter were used to hearing serious things from a distance while pushing a cart past open doors. They were not used to being invited into the room where those things were decided. Naomi tipped her head back to look up at her mother. Mama, she whispered, I did not mean to make your day worse. Denise looked down immediately. The fear in her face softened into something far older and deeper. She crouched enough to brush Naomi's braid gently back from her forehead. Baby, you did not make anything worse, she said. Her voice trembled once, then steadied. You saw something wrong, and you were brave. I just wish brave did not have to fall on you before breakfast. The sentence lingered in the room with a quiet ache. Jonathan felt it more than he expected. Before breakfast, a child should have been thinking about orange juice, school assignments, maybe whether the cafeteria would serve pizza sticks on Friday. Naomi had started her morning by stopping a corporate ambush in a hallway lined with glass and ego. There was something deeply wrong in that, and not only in the obvious way. He turned back to Naomi. What were you doing in the pantry before all this? He asked. Naomi blinked, surprised by the question. Math, she said. Fractions. My teacher says I rush the easy ones because I get bored. Margaret let out the faintest breath that might have been the beginning of a laugh if the morning had been a different one. Jonathan glanced at the worksheet still peeking from Naomi's backpack. Do you like math? Naomi shrugged, suddenly shy. It makes sense most of the time. Jonathan almost smiled. Most of the time. More wisdom in 5 words than he had heard from certain consultants billing $1,200 an hour. Helen stepped closer to the desk and lowered her voice. We also flagged an external recipient attached to the 612 file transfer. The domain is routed through a private acquisition group in Connecticut. If Richard moved the real numbers out before the vote, he may not have been trying to influence the board alone. He may have been setting up a secondary position. Jonathan's expression hardened, not dramatically, but with the kind of stillness that made other people stop filling silence with foolishness. Give me the name behind the acquisition shell, he said, and alert internal counsel that no one on the executive floor is to destroy documents. Wipe devices, or leave the building without clearance. Helen nodded once and stepped toward the side table to make the call. Denise's eyes widened slightly. Leave the building. Destroy documents. These were phrases from a world she knew only through television and news clips playing in laundromats. Yet here she was, standing in the center of it with her daughter. Naomi looked from one adult to another, taking in the way their faces had changed now that the truth was no longer deniable. She could not understand every legal detail, but she understood consequence. Adults only got this careful when something big had cracked. Jonathan walked to the window and stood there for a moment, one hand in his pocket, the city stretched out below him in exact lines and relentless movement. He could see the roofs of yellow taxis inching through traffic, a ferry dragging a white wake across the river, construction cranes frozen mid-turn against the brightening sky. From up here, systems always looked clean, ordered, rational, but order was often just distance. Get close enough to any machine, and you found the grinding parts. He turned back to the room. Denise, he said. She straightened at once, instinct pulling her spine taut. Yes, sir. How long have you worked here? Almost 4 years. And before that, hotel housekeeping in Midtown. Before that, a nursing home in Queens. Jonathan nodded, absorbing the answer with more attention than she seemed accustomed to receiving. And in 4 years here, has anyone ever asked for your full name in a room like this? Denise hesitated. No, sir. Then let me correct that now. Denise Carter, your daughter protected this company today. She protected every employee whose retirement account is tied to it, every research team whose work would have been buried in scandal, and every patient whose treatment depends on this place staying honest. Denise's breath caught. Naomi looked up at her mother with wide eyes. Jonathan did not look away. That matters. And so do you. Denise lowered her gaze for just a second, the way people do when a sentence hits somewhere too tender to display. When she looked back up, her eyes shone, but her voice remained composed. Thank you, sir. Jonathan shook his head once. Do not thank me for catching up to what your daughter already understood. Naomi stood very still after that, as if she were trying to hold the whole moment without dropping any of it. The office hummed softly around them, vent air whispering through hidden slats, a clock near the bookshelf moving with polite little clicks. Then Helen returned from the side table, phone still in hand, her expression sharper than before. We have the shell company name, she said. And there is something else. The registered manager is not just linked to Richard Voss. It is linked to a former board consultant Jonathan fired 3 years ago for conflict of interest. Jonathan's face changed, not into surprise, but recognition. Old Betrayal had just found a new door. Naomi watched him carefully and knew without understanding why that the morning was not getting smaller. It was getting deeper. Jonathan took the phone from Helen, read the name on the screen, and exhaled through his nose. When he looked back at Naomi, his voice was calm, but there was iron in it now. You did not just stop a bad vote, he said. You may have uncovered the reason someone has been circling this company for years. Jonathan Hale had spent years training himself never to react too quickly in front of other people. Markets punished impulse. Boards exploited visible emotion. Rivals watched for the smallest crack in a man's timing and drove straight through it. But as he stood there with Helen's phone in his hand, and the name of a former consultant glowing on the screen like an old ghost, he felt a rare and deeply private kind of anger. Not hot anger. Not loud anger. The colder kind. The kind that sharpened memory. 3 years earlier, he had removed Paul Mercer from a strategic advisory role after discovering quiet meetings, undisclosed interests, and a habit of showing up just 1 inch too close to deals that somehow benefited people outside the company. Nothing criminal had been proven then. Only the smell of rot. Just enough to cut him loose. Now that same man had resurfaced at the edge of a hidden acquisition shell tied to Richard Voss. And suddenly the morning no longer looked like sabotage born overnight. It looked patient, designed. Naomi watched Jonathan's face with the careful attention children gave storms. She did not know who Paul Mercer was. She did not know what an acquisition shell meant. But she knew when a room shifted from surprise to danger. Her mother felt it too. Denise pulled Naomi a little closer, almost without realizing she was doing it. The office seemed quieter than before, though the city outside the windows kept moving as if none of this mattered. A helicopter passed somewhere in the distance, its sound faint through the glass. A horn rose from the street below and disappeared. Inside, the only real noise was the low whisper of the ventilation system and the soft rustle of papers as Helen set a printed profile beside the access logs on Jonathan's desk. Paul Mercer was registered through the shell company 6 months ago, Helen said. The structure is layered, but not enough to hide the link entirely. If Richard was feeding him information, this may have been building for a while. Jonathan handed the phone back to her and looked toward Margaret. Where is Richard now? Margaret checked a message on her own screen. Conference room B. He asked if he should wait with the rest of the board. Jonathan let that sit for a second. The phrasing irritated him. Should he wait? As if this were still a matter of etiquette. As if the morning had not already broken open in plain sight. He can wait, Jonathan said. And he can keep waiting until I decide otherwise. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment, then lifted them again. Is that man in trouble? She asked softly. Every adult in the room turned toward her. It was such a child's question, small and direct, free of legal nuance and corporate theater. Not what are the implications. Not how bad is this. Just is that man in trouble? Jonathan looked at her for a long second before answering. Yes, he said, but that is not your burden to carry. Naomi nodded, though not as if she fully accepted the idea. Burden was one of those words children understood before they could define it. Denise brushed her thumb across Naomi's shoulder through the hoodie fabric. She always thinks everything is her responsibility once she sees it, Denise said quietly. Even at home. If the groceries look too heavy, she reaches first. If her little cousin cries, she goes before anyone asks. She notices things. There was pride in her voice, but also that old ache mothers carried when the strengths that made a child special were the same strengths that could make life harder. Jonathan looked at Naomi again, and for one brief moment he saw not only the child in front of him, but all the invisible labor that must have shaped her. The waiting quietly in corners. The learning when not to interrupt. The early understanding that adults did not always mean what they said and systems did not always protect the honest. Children were not supposed to become this perceptive by accident. Usually life taught them by charging too much. Helen slid another page from the folder. There is more, she said. The transfer at 6:12 this morning included not only the revised board packet. It also included an internal forecast memo and portions of the oncology licensing timeline. If that reached Mercer's side before today's vote, they may have been positioning for more than leverage. They may have been preparing to buy weakness they helped manufacture. Denise frowned slightly. The sentence was too technical, but Naomi heard the shape of it. Someone had tried to make something look weak on purpose so they could take it. Jonathan saw the understanding flicker across her face and chose simpler words. They wanted to hurt the company first, he said, then profit from the damage. Naomi's mouth parted a little. That is mean, she said. No one smiled. Because mean was childish language, yes, but it was also accurate in a way sophisticated adults often forgot how to be. So much corporate harm hid behind language that polished the cruelty right out of it. Strategy, positioning, exposure, realignment. But stripped clean, what sat beneath it was often as plain as a playground injustice. Take what is not yours. Push someone down while pretending you are only walking faster. Denise looked at Jonathan carefully. Sir, she said, choosing her words the way people without institutional power always had to. If Naomi needs to say more, we will stay. But if this is turning into something legal, I do not want anyone saying later that she was coached or handled wrong. She is just a child. Jonathan gave a slow nod. The caution in her voice was not distrust of Naomi. It was distrust of the world around Naomi. Distrust earned the hard way. You are right, he said. And she will be protected accordingly. Helen immediately understood. I will bring in internal counsel and a child-sensitive interviewer if needed, she said. No one speaks to Naomi without Denise present. No recording without consent. No pressure. Denise's shoulders loosened by the smallest visible amount. It was not comfort. Not yet. But it was 1 inch. Away from bracing for the worst. Jonathan walked back to the window, then turned before reaching it, restless in a way he rarely allowed himself to become. There is another problem, he said. If Mercer has been circling for years, and Richard felt safe enough to alter a live board packet, then this is not just about one man's ambition. It means somebody believed the culture here would help hide him. Margaret looked down. Helen said nothing. The truth landed anyway. Naomi looked from face to face and could feel the adults hearing something about themselves they had not planned to hear before lunch. Jonathan's voice did not rise, but it became harder, more exact. People do not scheme this comfortably in places where they expect to be seen. They scheme where arrogance has become routine, where assistants are expected not to question, where staff are expected not to notice, where children sitting in pantries are treated like furniture with shoelaces. Denise's head lifted slightly at that. Margaret's expression changed too, like a mirror being held at an angle she had avoided for years. Jonathan let the silence work. He had spent a lifetime mastering the boardroom version of silence, the tactical kind. This was different. This one was moral. Naomi stood very still, one hand resting on the front pocket of her backpack, with a folded math worksheet still weighted inside. Fractions. Purple star sticker. A normal school morning paused in the middle of extraordinary adult failure. Helen's phone buzzed again. She read the message, then looked up with a sharpened gaze. Information security just confirmed that Richard attempted to access a remote wipe protocol from conference room B 3 minutes ago. The block held, but he tried. Jonathan's face did not change. Somehow that was worse. Then he already knows the walls are closing, he said. Naomi looked up quickly. The phrase sounded like the beginning of something frightening. Jonathan saw that and softened his next words, but only for her. It means he is afraid now, he said. He should be. Then he looked to Helen. Bring him to the small executive conference room. No board audience. No hallway spectacle. I want every question asked where performance cannot save him. He turned to Denise. And if you agree, I would like Naomi to stay a little longer. Not to pressure her. To honor what she started. She deserves to know that truth does not disappear the moment powerful people close a door. Denise glanced down at her daughter. Naomi stared back with those solemn, searching eyes that had changed the course of the day before most children had finished breakfast. Denise inhaled slowly, then nodded once. We stay together, she said. Jonathan met her gaze and answered with equal steadiness. Together, then. Conference room 3 was smaller than the boardroom, but somehow felt more exposing. The long walnut table could seat 10, though only 6 chairs were occupied now. Jonathan Hale sat at the head, not because he needed the symbolism, but because the room had been built to point everything toward him. Helen Brooks sat to his right with a legal pad, 2 printed binders, and her tablet angled just enough to keep the screen private. Margaret Sloane remained near the far end, spine straight, hands folded too neatly in her lap. Denise Carter sat beside Naomi, one arm resting lightly behind her daughter's chair, as if the touch alone could turn any room into safer ground. Naomi's backpack was on the floor near her sneakers, the zipper half open, the corner of her fractions worksheet still visible inside like a quiet reminder that this had started as an ordinary weekday morning. The overhead lights were softer here, warmer than the executive hallway, but not warm enough to erase the tension pressing against the glass walls. Beyond them, the city glowed in pale late-morning silver. Inside, the silence had a pulse. Then the door opened, and Richard Voss walked in with the brittle calm of a man trying to dress panic in confidence. He wore the same blue tie with tiny white dots Naomi had remembered from the copy room, and the sight of it made her stomach tighten in a way she could not explain. Some details became heavier once adults confirmed they mattered. Richard looked first at Jonathan, then at Helen, then finally at Denise and Naomi. His expression altered by less than an inch when he saw them. But Naomi noticed. Children always noticed the moment an adult regretted underestimating them. Jonathan, Richard said, offering a restrained smile as he pulled out a chair. I would like to understand why I am being isolated from my own board meeting because of a technical discrepancy and a child's overheard story. Jonathan did not invite him to sit. The tiny pause before Richard lowered himself into the chair anyway made the room colder. You are here because a revised packet carrying material omissions was routed through delegated credentials tied to your office, Jonathan said. You are here because an outbound file transfer left your executive drive at 6:12 this morning. You are here because when those actions were flagged, you attempted to trigger a remote wipe from conference room B. Richard's jaw flexed once. He placed both hands on the table, palms down, like a man preparing to discuss numbers instead of consequences. Delegated credentials are used across departments, he said. Remote protocols are sometimes triggered accidentally on mobile devices. You know this, Jonathan. This kind of theater helps no one. Helen slid a printed page across the table. The protocol was manually initiated through a multi-step menu sequence. That is not an accidental thumb slip. Richard barely looked at the paper. Instead, his eyes shifted toward Naomi, and this time Denise's hand moved fully onto her daughter's shoulder. The gesture was gentle, but its meaning filled the room. Mine. Richard's voice softened in a way Naomi disliked immediately. And what exactly are we doing here? He asked. Putting a child in the center of executive legal exposure because she found a page by a printer? Naomi looked down at the wood grain in the table and focused on the pattern until the heat in her chest settled. Jonathan noticed. You will not address her directly unless I ask you to, he said. Richard turned back toward him, blinking once at the firmness in the words. I am not attacking her. I am questioning the wisdom of building a case around a 9-year-old's interpretation. No, Jonathan said. You are testing whether the room will return to the old habit of making her feel smaller than the truth she carried into it. Nobody moved after that. Richard's expression held, but the effort of holding it had become visible now. Helen opened one of the binders and placed 3 documents side by side. The archived packet, the circulated packet, and the recovered printout Naomi had handed Jonathan in the hallway. The paper edges aligned almost perfectly. The differences did not. Page references were altered, Helen said. The loss table was shifted from a highlighted section into a neutral appendix and then netted against projections not approved. For summary inclusion, the metadata trail was masked through delegated review, but the archive and print spool logs remain. She tapped a line with her pen. And this print event occurred 3 minutes after your badge accessed the copy room corridor. Richard finally glanced at the documents. Badge proximity does not prove authorship. No, Jonathan said. But authorship is not the only thing being measured today. Intent leaves its own shape. Naomi listened to the adults' voices move across terms like metadata, authorship, delegated review, and intent. She did not know all the definitions, but she knew their rhythm now. This was the part where grown people built walls out of long words and hoped nobody noticed the fear hiding behind them. Richard leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, as if patience itself were proof of innocence. Let us say, for the sake of argument, that the packet was rearranged in a way you do not like, he said. That still does not explain why we are entertaining conspiracy because a child overheard part of a conversation in a service corridor. Jonathan folded his hands. Then let us stop entertaining and start listening. He turned his head slightly toward Naomi. Not forcing, not performing, simply making room. Naomi, he said, you only need to tell the part you remember clearly. Nothing more. Denise looked down at her daughter, and Naomi felt that familiar moment arrive, the one where adults stopped talking around her, and the room opened like a stage she never wanted but somehow could not leave. Her mouth felt dry. The air conditioning hummed softly above them. Somewhere outside the glass, an elevator chimed and kept moving. Naomi lifted her eyes, not to Richard first, but to Jonathan, because he was the one who had asked like truth mattered more than speed. I was in the pantry doing fractions, she said. Her voice came out small, but steady enough. I heard Mr. Voss tell another man that you trusted the room too much. He said no one points to gray appendices before a vote. Then the printer jammed, and I found the page. Richard gave a quick shake of the head. That is selective memory shaped by stress. Naomi's fingers curled against her own knees. Before Jonathan could respond, she spoke again. You also said nobody on that floor reads what they clean around. The words hit the table like a dropped glass. Denise inhaled sharply. Margaret looked away. Helen's pen stopped moving. Richard did not answer at first. For the first time since entering the room, he looked not strategic, not offended, not polished. Just briefly stripped of options. Jonathan saw it and knew the moment had come. Do you deny saying that? He asked. Richard's eyes moved from Naomi to Denise, then to Jonathan. I deny the context being presented, he said at last. People say careless things in passing. That does not make them evidence of fraud. Jonathan's stare never shifted. No, he said. It makes them evidence of contempt. Fraud is in the logs. The sentence sat in the room like stone. Naomi did not fully understand why it mattered so much, but she could feel it. Something was breaking, and not in a loud way. In the quiet way ice gives under weight before anyone admits the lake is no longer safe. Helen slid another page forward. There is also the matter of the 612 transfer to the Mercer-linked shell, she said. Richard's eyes dropped to it, and this time they stayed there a fraction too long. Jonathan noticed. So did Naomi. Some faces smiled with the mouth and panicked with the eyes. Children saw that faster than analysts ever did. Richard drew in a measured breath. Paul Mercer consults across industries. Contact with him is not a crime. Jonathan leaned forward by an inch, and somehow that inch changed the room. Trying to damage the company in order to profit from its weakness may be. Richard's expression thinned. The tie with the little white dots looked suddenly too bright against his shirt collar. Naomi felt her mother's hand tighten at her shoulder, not painfully, just enough to say, "I am here. Keep breathing." Jonathan turned toward Helen without taking his eyes off Richard. "Ask the next question," he said. Helen opened the second binder, and when she spoke, even the air in the room seemed to listen. "Mr. Voss," she said, "why did your office credentials access oncology forecast files 47 minutes before the altered packet was transmitted? And why did those exact file names appear in the Mercer transfer bundle 6 hours later?" Richard stared at the page, then at Helen, then at Jonathan. For one long second, nobody in the room moved. Naomi could hear her own heartbeat in the strange padded quiet. Richard's answer, when it came, was calm enough to sound practiced and thin enough to sound false. "Because," he said, "someone wanted it to look that way." Richard let the sentence hang in the room as if it might become more believable if he gave it enough silence to breathe. Someone wanted it to look that way. He said it with the careful calm of a man who had spent years surviving by sounding reasonable 5 seconds longer than everyone else. Naomi watched his face and felt the strange mismatch children often noticed before adults did. His voice was smooth, but his hands were not. One thumb pressed too hard against the edge of the table. The skin near his knuckles had gone pale. Denise felt Naomi shift beside her and covered the little movement with a gentle stroke along her daughter's back. Conference room 3 had become so still that every tiny sound mattered now. The soft click of Helen Brooks's pen. The low mechanical sigh of the air vent overhead. Somewhere far outside the glass, a siren moved through downtown traffic and disappeared again. Jonathan Hale did not rush to fill the silence. He had spent too much of his life around liars not to recognize what happened when you let them hear their own answer settle in the air. Good lies like momentum. Bad lies sagged under stillness. This one sagged almost immediately. "Then tell me who," Jonathan said. Not loud, not dramatic, just precise. Richard blinked once. "I am saying the trail may have been manipulated." "By who?" Jonathan repeated. Richard spread one hand as if patience itself were evidence. "We both know how many people touch these systems. Legal assistants, finance leads, compliance reviewers. Anyone with delegated access could have shaped the log trail." Helen turned one of the binders toward him and rested a finger on the lower corner of the page. "The delegated access was initiated using a physical token assigned to your office safe," she said. "At 11:58 last night. The same safe logged open by your badge at 11:56. There were no secondary badge entries on your floor for the next 32 minutes. Richard's gaze moved to the page, then away again too quickly. Naomi caught it. So did Jonathan. That brief refusal to look fully at the facts had its own smell. It smelled like a man already searching for a new story. Margaret Sloane sat very still, but inside, something had begun to twist. She had worked around Richard for 2 years. She knew his preferences, his habits, the way he liked to pause before asking for coffee, the way he never forgot a number that served him. She was now discovering she had also memorized the early signs of his fear without realizing she had done it. "There is another issue," Helen said, pulling a second document free. "At 6:14 this morning, 2 minutes after the Mercer transfer left the server, an unsent draft email was recovered from your laptop cache. It was never delivered, but the subject line was preserved." Richard's chin lifted. Draft cache recovery is notoriously unreliable. Helen did not blink. The subject line read, "Once the vote locks, move before the downgrade ripples." Denise felt Naomi go very still beside her. Children did not always understand finance, but they understood the shape of bad intention. Once the vote locks, move before the downgrade ripples. Even in Naomi's 9-year-old mind, those words sounded like somebody setting a trap and then planning where to stand when it snapped. Richard finally looked angry now, but it was the anger of a man losing control of his own timing. "You are building a narrative from fragments," he said. "Unsent cache text. Partial logs. A child's overheard sentence. This is not evidence. This is theater built on pressure." Jonathan leaned back by barely an inch, and somehow that small movement made his attention feel even heavier. "No," he said. "Pressure is what you counted on. Evidence is what remained anyway." Naomi looked down at her own hands. They were small against the dark wood, one thumbnail chipped with a dot of purple marker from yesterday's homework. She remembered sitting at the pantry table with her math sheet and hearing Richard's voice through the half-open copy room door. She remembered not wanting to listen and then not being able not to. Adults always said children should not eavesdrop, as if listening were the worst thing happening in a room. But sometimes listening was the only reason a bad thing did not get to stay hidden. Jonathan turned his head toward her again, his voice softer now. "Naomi, there is only one part one need you to answer," he said. "When you heard Mr. Voss speak in the copy room, did he sound confused about the file, or certain?" Naomi looked up. The question was simple enough for truth to fit inside. "Certain," she said. "He sounded like when kids at school already know the answer and pretend they are asking anyway." For the first time all morning, Helen's mouth almost moved like she might react, but she held it back. Jonathan did not. A tiny shift crossed his face. Not amusement. Recognition. Richard exhaled sharply through his nose. "With respect, Jonathan, are we now translating motive through playground analogies?" "Sometimes playground analogies are cleaner than corporate language," Jonathan said. "At least children do not call a shove strategic alignment." The sentence landed harder than the room expected. Denise lowered her eyes, and Margaret looked toward the windows again, as if the city outside might offer some place to rest from what was being said inside. Richard folded his arms. Defensive now. Closed. The performance had shrunk. "You are making this personal," he said. Jonathan's reply came without delay. "You made it personal the moment you assumed invisible people do not hear." Naomi felt something warm and frightening move through her chest at the same time. No adult had ever said something like that in a room like this, while meaning people like her mother, Denise Carter, who wiped fingerprints from executive glass before sunrise. Denise Carter, who knew which elevators to avoid when investors came in because no one said it aloud, but everyone expected staff traffic to stay out of frame. The truth in Jonathan's voice did not fix those years, but for 1 second it named them, and naming mattered. Helen slid another paper forward. "There is one more item," she said. "Building security pulled audio from the copy room corridor after we flagged the time window. The quality is partial, but enough to isolate 2 phrases." Richard's eyes narrowed. This time, he did not bother hiding the reaction. Jonathan saw it. So did Naomi, and that frightened her more than any raised voice would have. Calm had finally left him. "Play it," Jonathan said. Helen reached for her tablet and tapped the file. The recording came through the room's speaker, thin and metallic, shaped by hard walls and distant machinery. First the hum of a printer, then footsteps, then Richard's voice, unmistakable even through static. Not replaced. Protected. A rustle of paper. Another man asking something too muffled to catch. Then Richard again, clearer this time. "Jonathan trusts the room too much. Nobody points to gray appendices before a vote." Naomi's breath caught. Denise's hand tightened around hers. On the recording, there was a scrape, then the sharp mechanical grind of a printer misfeeding pages. The other man muttered. And then came the line that changed the room from suspicion into something cleaner and harsher. Richard's own voice, cool and casual, carried through the speaker with ugly clarity. "It does not matter. Nobody on this floor reads what they clean around." No one moved after that. Even the city beyond the windows seemed to fall away. Richard stared at the black speaker puck in the center of the table as though it had betrayed him personally. Helen set the tablet down with measured care. Margaret closed her eyes. Denise did not. She looked straight at Richard now, not with drama, not with rage, but with the exhausted steadiness of someone who had spent too long being talked around by people who never imagined she might one day hear herself described out loud. Jonathan kept his gaze on Richard for a full second more before speaking. "Do you still want to call this theater?" Richard's mouth opened, then shut. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the sound of a lie finally realizing it had been left alone in a room full of proof. The room stayed silent long enough for the air conditioning to become a presence of its own. It moved softly through the vents above them, cool and indifferent, while Richard Voss sat at the conference table with the last of his composure draining from places he could no longer control. The recording had not raised its voice. It had not needed to. A person could spend years polishing the way he sounded in public, but when truth came back through a cheap ceiling microphone, stripped of charm and timing, it told on him in ways polished people never forgave. Naomi sat very still beside her mother, eyes lowered to the grain of the walnut table, but every part of her was listening. Denise's hand remained wrapped around hers, warm and firm, the one steady thing in a room full of shifting adults. Jonathan Hale did not speak immediately. He had learned that some moments were too important to rush past with language. Richard's words still seemed to hang over the table like smoke that would not clear. Nobody on this floor reads what they clean around. Denise had probably lived inside sentences like that for years without hearing them said so plainly. Jonathan looked at her then, and for the first time that morning, he let himself truly see what had always existed just outside the edges of his own power. The early shifts, the quiet shoes on polished tile, the carts tucked out of investor sight, the women and men who entered rooms after decisions had been made and erased the visible evidence that anyone important had ever been there at all. Hale Biotech had not become vulnerable to men like Richard only because of greed. It had become vulnerable because arrogance had made invisibility normal. Richard cleared his throat, the sound too loud in the stillness. "I said something careless," he said at last. "That much is obvious. But careless language is not proof of criminal conduct." Helen Brooks did not bother disguising the chill in her expression. "No," she said. "The packet alteration, the transfer logs, the draft subject line, the remote wipe attempt, and the Mercer link are doing that work already." Richard turned toward Jonathan with the expression of a man trying to step back into a role that no longer fit. "You know how this looks because you want it to look this way," he said. "You are angry. I understand that. But anger is not governance. We should bring in outside counsel, suspend conclusions, and avoid contaminating the process with emotional reactions." Naomi looked up at that. Emotional reactions. It was such a grown-up phrase, smooth and cold and slippery. It sounded like a way of putting a blanket over a fire and then calling the smoke an overreaction. Jonathan folded his hands once, slowly. "Do not mistake restraint for uncertainty," he said. "This process is already underway. The only thing you are losing in this room is your ability to direct it." Richard's eye sharpened. "You cannot sideline a board member on incomplete facts." "Watch me," Jonathan said. The words were quiet, but they landed with a weight that changed the room all over again. Margaret Sloane lowered her gaze, not out of discomfort this time, but because she knew what that tone meant. Jonathan. Hale was done debating whether the ground beneath Richard still belonged to him. Helen opened a second folder and slid a formal notice across the table. The paper looked unremarkable, just black text on white stock, but Naomi could feel the adults react to it before anyone said a word. Documents had different temperatures in rooms like this. Some were routine. Some changed lives. "Pending full review," Helen said. "Your system access is suspended. Your board privileges are frozen under emergency governance provisions, and you are instructed not to contact any employee, consultant, or external party regarding this matter." Richard stared at the page without touching it. "Emergency provisions," he repeated, almost to himself. "Over this." Jonathan's eyes never left him. "Over this," he said. Richard finally reached for the paper. His fingers were steady now, but Naomi had begun to understand something important about adults. Calm was not the opposite of fear. Sometimes it was fear after it had decided to hide in a better jacket. He read the notice once, then placed it back on the table with exaggerated care. "And what do you expect happens next?" he asked. "You think markets will reward this? You think the board will thank you for blowing up a vote because a child interrupted your hallway and you chose to believe her?" Naomi felt the heat rise in her chest again, but before she could think about it too hard, Jonathan answered. "I chose to verify her," he said. "The fact that verification became exposure is not her burden. It is yours." Denise's breath trembled in a way only Naomi could feel because she was sitting close enough to notice. For years, Denise had taught herself how to be small in buildings like this, how to finish a task without becoming part of the scenery in a way that bothered anyone, How to keep her daughter safe by teaching her to wait, to whisper, to stay near the pantry table, and not ask why some elevators were clearly not meant for them. And now the most powerful man in the company was saying, out loud, in front of legal counsel and senior staff, that the burden did not belong to her child. Denise looked down for a second, blinking hard. She was not a woman who cried easily in front of strangers. Life had made that a luxury. But this was not weakness. This was what happened when dignity arrived in a place where humiliation had expected to keep the seat warm forever. Richard turned his head toward Naomi then, almost despite himself. You have any idea what you have done? He asked. Denise's posture changed instantly. So did Jonathan's. That is enough, Jonathan said, and his voice cut through the room with clean finality. Richard looked back at him, but the damage was done. Naomi felt her mother's arm come more fully around the back of her chair. Mine again. Always mine. Still, the question echoed in Naomi's mind. Did she know what she had done? Not all of it. She knew she had stopped him in the hallway. She knew the page mattered. She knew the adults were now using words like governance and suspension and external counsel. But the full shape of it was still larger than she could hold. What she did know was simpler. If she had stayed quiet, something wrong would have gone forward just because everyone important had been moving too fast to notice it. Jonathan saw the thought moving across her face and softened before he spoke. Naomi, he said, what you did was tell the truth before power could outrun it. She looked at him, blinking once. The sentence settled in her slowly. Jonathan continued, not for performance, not for anyone else in the room, but because children needed language too when adults made messes large enough to swallow a morning. You did not create this. You revealed it. Naomi's fingers loosened a little in her mother's hand. Richard gave a short, humorless breath. You are elevating a lucky interruption into a moral event. Jonathan leaned back in his chair and let the silence answer first. Then he said, no, I am recognizing that the people your kind of arrogance counts on ignoring are often the only ones still paying attention. Helen gathered the documents into clean stacks, the faint whisper of paper sounding almost ceremonial now. Margaret looked toward Denise and Naomi for a brief second, and in that glance was something like shame, but not useless shame. The kind that begins as discomfort and might, if a person is honest enough, turn into change. Outside the glass walls, sunlight had climbed higher over the city. The silver on the river had brightened into something almost white. Time had moved. The board meeting that was supposed to define the morning no longer mattered in the way everyone had expected. Something else had taken its place. Not just an investigation. A reckoning. Helen's phone vibrated against the tabletop. She checked the screen and looked up at Jonathan. Internal counsel is here, she said. And there is another update. Mercer's shell company just tried to withdraw a standing offer connected to the oncology portfolio. They know the window is closing. Jonathan gave one small nod. Good, he said. Richard's eyes narrowed. You think this ends with me, he said quietly. Jonathan stood then, not abruptly, just with the measured certainty of a man whose next steps no longer required debate. No, he said. I think this starts with you. He turned toward Denise and Naomi, and when he spoke again, his voice changed in a way that made the room feel different for the second time that day. You have both done enough for one morning. But if you are willing, I want you to stay a little longer. Not because I need more from you. Because I want you to see what happens when truth is not sent back to the pantry. The hallway outside conference room 3 had changed by the time Denise and Naomi stepped out with Margaret Sloan. It was still the same polished executive floor with silent elevators, framed patents, and glass that reflected everybody a little too sharply, but now the movement inside it had lost its old confidence. Assistants walked faster without speaking. 2 legal staff members stood near the corner alcove with tablets pressed to their chests, voices lowered to almost nothing. A security officer in a navy blazer remained by the elevator bank, no longer decorative, no longer part of the background. Naomi noticed these things because noticing had become the shape of her morning. Denise noticed something else. No one was looking through her now. Not completely. People who had passed her for 4 years as if she were a useful shadow were now stepping slightly aside when she walked by, not out of kindness exactly, but because the orbit of her daughter's truth had reached them too. Margaret guided them toward a smaller lounge just off the executive corridor, a room with pale gray chairs, a coffee station, and windows facing east over the river. On a normal day, it was used for waiting investors and nervous consultants. Today it felt almost human. "Please stay here for a little while," Margaret said, her voice careful, less polished than usual. "I will make sure you have what you need." Denise nodded automatically, still moving with the caution of a person who had not yet decided whether safety was real or temporary. Naomi sat at the edge of one of the chairs and slipped her backpack into her lap. The fractions worksheet was still inside, folded at one corner where it had been pushed down too quickly. She touched the paper through the fabric and felt a strange tug inside her chest. It belonged to the version of the day where her biggest problem had been long division before lunch. Margaret turned toward the coffee station, then paused. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked. Denise almost said no out of reflex, but Naomi answered first. "Orange juice." Margaret gave the smallest real smile Naomi had seen on her face all day. "Orange juice," she said, as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. Once she moved away, Denise let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since the elevator doors first opened that morning. She sat beside Naomi and leaned forward, elbows on knees, looking out at the river through the wide glass. "Baby," she said softly, "I need you to know something." Naomi turned toward her. Denise's face was tired now, not just from work, but from the emotional weight of being pulled into a world where one wrong word could change rent, groceries, and peace all at once. "I am proud of you," Denise said. "Do you hear me? I am proud of you. But I am also sorry that you had to be the brave one in a place where grown folks should have been doing their jobs." Naomi listened carefully. "I did not want you to get in trouble," she said. "I know." Denise looked at her then, fully, the way mothers do when the world has asked too much from a child, and they are trying to gather the pieces without letting the child feel blamed for breaking. "You were trying to protect somebody," she said. "That matters. I just hate that my first thought was fear instead of surprise." Naomi thought about that. Fear instead of surprise. It sounded true. It sounded like the reason her mother always told her not to wander and not to touch things and not to speak loudly in offices with thick carpet and expensive air. Before Naomi could answer, the lounge door opened and Jonathan Hale stepped in without his jacket. It was the first time she had seen him without the full armor of the morning. His dress shirt sleeves were still buttoned, but one side of his collar had shifted slightly, and the absence of the jacket made him look less like a man cut out of the building itself, and more like someone carrying the weight of what had just been uncovered. He stopped near the doorway rather than walking all the way in at once, giving the room a chance to accept him on different terms. "May I come in?" he asked. Denise rose halfway from her seat before he even finished speaking. "Sir, you do not have to ask." Jonathan shook his head once. "Today I do." The sentence changed the room more than if he had apologized. Denise sat back down slowly. Jonathan stepped farther inside, then looked at Naomi. "I wanted you both to know what is happening next before you hear it through hallways and guesses." Naomi straightened in her chair, orange juice forgotten in her hand. Jonathan remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair opposite them, as if he knew taking a seat too quickly might make this feel like another meeting instead of a human conversation. "Richard Voss has been formally suspended pending full board action," he said. "Internal counsel has begun preservation orders. External investigators are being brought in. And the Mercer transaction linked to the oncology portfolio has stalled because they know the vote is no longer available to manipulate." Denise absorbed the words carefully, her expression caught between relief and disbelief. Naomi followed only part of it, but she understood enough. The bad thing had not slipped away after adults closed the door. It was still being held where people had to look at it. Jonathan looked out at the river for a second before continuing. "I also met with 2 board members by secure call," he said. "I told them exactly how this started." Denise's body tensed by habit. "Sir, Naomi does not need her name all over this company." Jonathan looked back at her immediately. "I agree. Her privacy will be protected." Then he added, more quietly, "But her role will not be erased." Denise's eyes lowered. There it was again, that difficult thing she did not quite know how to accept yet. Respect that did not come with a trap attached. Jonathan turned his attention to Naomi. "Do you know what one of the board members asked me?" Naomi shook her head. "He asked how an entire executive floor missed what a 9-year-old girl noticed in one morning." Naomi blinked. "What did you say?" Jonathan's answer came without delay. "I said because she was listening for truth, and too many adults were listening for convenience. The words settled over the lounge with the soft heaviness of rain beginning somewhere far away. Denise pressed her lips together. Naomi looked down at the orange juice bottle in her hand, turning it slightly so the light hit the plastic. Listening for truth. She liked the sound of it, even if it made her feel bigger and smaller at the same time. Jonathan stepped closer now, but only enough to soften the distance, not invade it. "There is one more thing," he said. Denise's eyes lifted again, cautious. Jonathan met her gaze first, then Naomi's. "No one in this building should ever have spoken about the people who work here the way Richard did. Not in private. Not in passing. Not with the assumption that nobody important would hear it." His voice remained level, but Naomi could hear something underneath it now. Not just anger. Regret. "I built a company that prides itself on intelligence," he continued, "and I still allowed parts of it to become blind where they should have been most awake. That is on me." Denise stared at him in silence. Men in power did not often say words like that without turning them into speeches about growth and leadership and future values. But he stopped right there, before the language got glossy. Naomi felt the difference even if she could not describe it. Jonathan pulled a folded card from his shirt pocket and set it on the low table in front of them. It was simple, cream-colored, with his direct office number written by hand on the back. "This is for you, Denise," he said. "Not for publicity. Not for optics. If anyone in this company makes this day harder for you or for Naomi, you call me directly." Denise looked at the card as if it might disappear if she touched it too fast. "Sir," she began, but Jonathan shook his head gently. "My name is Jonathan," he said. "At least in this room." Naomi looked from the card to his face and saw the smallest break in the hard edges she had first seen in the hallway. Something in him had shifted too. Power had not left him. It had simply stopped pretending it did not owe anything. Denise finally picked up the card and held it between her fingers like fragile proof that mornings could change shape in ways no one planned for. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words were not about survival. Jonathan nodded once, then glanced toward the door as if measuring the next wave of consequences already waiting for him. Before turning away, he looked back at Naomi. "You asked earlier if Richard was in trouble," he said. Naomi nodded. "He is. But because you told the truth, a lot of other people may finally have a chance not to be." Naomi sat very still after that, the bottle cool in her hand, the city bright beyond the glass, the folded math sheet still waiting in her bag like a life from an hour ago. Jonathan moved toward the door, then paused one last time. "The full board is assembling now," he said. "And for the first time today, they are not asking what was in the packet." He looked at Naomi with quiet certainty. "They are asking who the girl in the hallway was." By the time the full board assembled, the building no longer felt like it belonged to routine. It felt like it belonged to consequence. Denise and Naomi remained in the lounge while the executive floor shifted around them with the strange hush that came when very powerful people realized the story they had prepared for the day was no longer the one unfolding. Margaret Sloane moved in and out twice, each time with quieter eyes and less of the polished distance she had worn that morning. On her second trip back, she brought Naomi a small paper bag from the downstairs cafe. Inside was a blueberry muffin still warm in the middle. "You have not eaten enough for a day like this," she said, placing it gently on the table. Naomi looked at her, surprised by the softness. "Thank you." Margaret nodded once, then glanced toward Denise. "The board is in closed session now. Internal counsel is present. So are two outside directors on video." She hesitated before adding, "Jonathan has not let your daughter's name be treated like a footnote." After she left, Denise stared down at the cream-colored card Jonathan had given her, still resting beside the untouched orange juice bottle. She had folded and unfolded the corner of her apron so many times that the fabric now sat with a permanent crease. Naomi broke the muffin in half and handed the larger piece to her mother without a word. Denise smiled tiredly and took it. "You always do that," she said. "What?" Naomi asked. "Give away the bigger half like I will not notice." Naomi shrugged and took a bite of her own piece. The sweetness sat oddly beside the morning. It tasted like something from normal life, trying hard to catch up. Denise watched her chew, then looked out at the river again. "When you were 3, she said quietly, "you used to point at everything. Clouds, buses, birds on the fire escape, cracked tiles in the grocery store. You never missed a thing. My mama used to say, That child is going to make people uncomfortable one day because she sees what they want to step over. Naomi swallowed and looked at her mother. Was Grandma right? Denise let out the faintest laugh, warm but worn. Looks like she was. The lounge door opened again a few minutes later, but this time it was not Margaret. It was an older man Naomi had not seen before, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with a navy suit that looked expensive in the plain, quiet way old money often did. Behind him stood Jonathan Hale and Helen Brooks. The older man stopped a few feet inside the room, his expression serious but not severe. "Miss Carter," he said, looking first to Denise, then to Naomi. "My name is Arthur Bell. I am the lead independent director on Hale Biotech's board." Denise stood immediately, then seemed unsure whether she was supposed to. Arthur Bell noticed and gave a small shake of his head. "Please do not stand on my account," he said. "I came in here because too many important things have already been said about your daughter in rooms she was expected to stay outside of." Denise slowly sat back down. Naomi held very still, one hand resting on the edge of the muffin bag. Jonathan remained near the door, not taking the focus, just present. Arthur Bell looked at Naomi with the kind of attention that did not patronize. "I wanted to meet the young lady who prevented a very costly lie from being dressed up as governance," he said. Naomi blinked. She was not sure she understood every word, but she understood enough to know he meant the truth had mattered. "I just told what I heard," she said softly. Arthur nodded. "That is often the bravest part." He glanced briefly at Jonathan, and something passed between them that Naomi could not name. Not business. Older than that. The look of one man forcing another to examine the gap between leadership and seeing clearly. Arthur turned back to Denise. "I also want to apologize," he said. Denise's eyes widened slightly. Board directors did not apologize to people like her. At least not in the world she had learned to survive in. Arthur seemed to know exactly what her silence meant. "Not for Richard Voss alone," he continued. "What he did was his choice. But the conditions that let him feel safe doing it under this roof were not built by one man. Boards like ours like to believe arrogance arrives from outside. It does not. Sometimes it grows quietly inside institutions that mistake hierarchy for order." The room went still again, but not in the hard way from earlier. This stillness felt closer to being witnessed. Denise looked down once, then back up. "Thank you for saying that," she said carefully. Arthur Bell nodded and placed a slim folder on the low table. "This is not a contract," he said, anticipating the caution in her eyes. "It is a written statement confirming that neither your employment nor your daughter's access to this building today will be held against you. It also documents that Naomi's identity is to remain confidential outside protected internal review unless you authorize otherwise." Denise stared at the folder as if it were written in a language she had spent years being told was not for her. Jonathan stepped forward then, only enough to make the next part feel personal instead of procedural. "Arthur asked for it himself," he said. Denise looked from Jonathan to Arthur, and back again. Naomi understood only one thing for certain. The truth was staying in the room. It was not being folded away into adult language and sent somewhere she would never see again. Arthur crouched slightly, enough to meet Naomi's eye line without towering. "Your mother told the truth with her work long before today," he said. "People who care for buildings care for the people in them, whether those people notice or not. You did the same thing in a different way." Naomi looked at her mother, then back at him. "My mom says cleaning is how you show respect to a place." Arthur smiled, but only with his eyes. "Then perhaps this company has been respected by the wrong people for a very long time." Jonathan heard that and lowered his gaze for a brief second. It struck Naomi then that grown men with money and titles could still look ashamed when the right sentence found them. Helen stepped closer to Arthur and handed him a single printed page. He read it quickly, then looked up at Jonathan. "The board vote passed," he said. Naomi's stomach dropped before she understood the rest. Then Arthur continued. "Richard Voss has been removed from all committee roles, referred for external investigation, and barred from representing the company in any capacity effective immediately. The board also approved a full independent review of executive culture and reporting channels." Denise covered her mouth with her fingertips. Jonathan did not look relieved exactly. Relief was too small for what crossed his face. It was more like a man watching a door finally open in a wall he had pretended for too long was not there. Arthur Bell placed the page back into the folder. "One more thing," he said. The board requested that a private note of thanks be prepared for Naomi's school file, if you want it. Not public. Not performative. Simply true. Naomi stared at him. My school file. Arthur nodded. Sometimes the world is eager to record a child's mistakes and slow to record her courage. We would prefer not to repeat that habit. Denise's eyes filled then, not with spectacle, not with collapse, but with the quiet overflow of a woman who had spent years bracing for indifference and had not built much practice receiving respect. Naomi leaned gently against her side. Jonathan watched them and understood, maybe for the first time in years, that some forms of repair did not begin in the boardroom at all. They began in whether people who had been asked to stay invisible were finally spoken to, as if their inner lives counted. Arthur rose to his full height again. I will leave you to breathe, he said. It has been a long morning. He turned toward the door, but before stepping out, he looked back at Naomi one last time. Young lady, he said, rooms like ours are very good at recognizing confidence. We are not always as good at recognizing conscience. Today you reminded us there is a difference. After he left, the lounge seemed larger somehow, or maybe just lighter. Denise ran one hand over Naomi's braid and let it rest at the back of her neck. Jonathan remained where he was for a moment, one hand near the doorframe, as if he knew there was still something unfinished between them. Finally, he stepped forward and looked not at Denise first, but at Naomi. The board wants to know your full name for the record, he said. Naomi straightened a little. Naomi Carter. Jonathan nodded. Naomi Carter, he repeated, as if making sure the company itself had finally learned how to say it without looking past her. Then he reached into his shirt pocket again and unfolded a small square of paper. It was her fractions worksheet, smoothed out as much as possible. In one corner, above the purple star sticker, someone had written in neat black ink, "Seen." He held it toward her carefully, and when Naomi took it, she understood that the morning had changed more than one vote. It had changed who was no longer allowed to disappear. The lounge grew quiet after that in a way Naomi would remember long after she forgot the exact order of the grown-up words. The kind of quiet that did not feel empty, but earned. Her fractions worksheet rested in her lap now, the paper smooth and slightly warm from her hands, the word seen written above the purple star sticker in neat black ink. She traced the letters once with the edge of her thumb, not enough to smudge them, just enough to prove they were real. Denise sat beside her with the cream-colored card still tucked between her fingers and the folder from Arthur Bell resting unopened on the low table. Outside the wide windows, the river flashed white in the noon light. Tugboats moved slowly below like patient thoughts. The city had returned to its usual motion, but inside the executive floor something had shifted that could not be put back where it had been. Jonathan Hale remained near the lounge doorway for a few seconds more, as though he understood that leaving too fast would make the morning feel unfinished. Then he stepped farther in and closed the door softly behind him. Without the traffic of assistants and lawyers moving through the hall, the room felt more private than any place Naomi had been all day. Jonathan looked at the worksheet in her lap, then at Denise. There is one more decision I would like to make before this day ends, he said. Denise straightened a little, not out of fear this time, but from habit. People in authority had asked things of her for so many years that her body still prepared itself before her mind had time to judge whether the request was fair. Jonathan noticed. He was starting to notice many things he had once walked past. This is not about publicity, he said, and it is not a reward designed to make the company look generous for cleaning up its own failure. It is about responsibility. Denise's eyes remained careful. What kind of responsibility? Jonathan glanced down briefly, collecting the words before using them. The kind that begins after gratitude, he said. Naomi looked up at him. She did not understand exactly what that meant, but she understood the tone. It was the sound adults used when they were trying to say something honest without dressing it up. Jonathan moved to the chair across from them and finally sat. The room changed again, not because he was less powerful seated there, but because power looked different when it chose not to tower. Naomi, he said, your mother told me you are good at math. Naomi gave a small shrug. Most of the time. Jonathan nodded as if that answer mattered. And from what I have seen today, you are good at something even rarer. You pay attention when other people have taught themselves not to. Naomi looked down at the worksheet again. The paper had begun the day as ordinary. Now it felt like part of a story she was still inside. Jonathan. folded his hands loosely. Hale Biotech funds educational grants through a foundation tied to our research initiatives, he said. Denise's expression changed immediately, not into hope exactly, but into the kind of caution people feel when life has taught them that generosity can come with strings hidden in the lining. Jonathan saw that too. This would not be charity, he said gently, and it would not be a public campaign. I want to establish a private education trust in Naomi's name, overseen independently, to support whatever academic path she chooses later on. School programs, books, tutoring, summer science camps, college one day if she wants it. The structure would belong to her future, not to the company's image. Naomi's eyes widened, but Denise did not speak right away. The idea was too large to enter a life built on paycheck timing and careful grocery math without knocking over every instinct that kept a person safe. Sir, Denise said at last, then corrected herself softly. Jonathan, that is more than generous. That is, she stopped because some offers are so far outside the shape of your ordinary life that language reaches for them and comes back unsure. Jonathan shook his head once. It is not more than what I owe after learning how much my company has asked invisible people to absorb in silence, he said. And it still would not balance the scale. But it would be a beginning. Naomi listened carefully, trying to fit words like trust and independently in college into her 9-year-old imagination. She could picture books. She could picture summer. She could picture a college only in the way children picture faraway cities, as a place with big staircases and backpacks and people carrying too many papers. Denise looked down at her daughter. Baby, do you understand what he is saying? Naomi thought for a second. He is saying I can keep learning, she answered. Jonathan's face softened by half an inch. Yes, he said. That is exactly what I am saying. Denise lowered her eyes after that, and when she looked up again, there was moisture in them she no longer seemed interested in hiding. Nobody in offices like this has ever offered my child a future without first making me afraid of the price, she said quietly. Jonathan took that in without flinching. He did not rush to deny it with the easy language of good intentions. Then let me say the price clearly, he answered. The price is that I have to become the kind of leader who does not need a child in worn sneakers to teach him where his own building has gone blind. The sentence settled into the room with no place to hide from it. Naomi did not understand every part, but she understood enough to know he was not only talking about Richard Voss anymore. He was talking about all the spaces around the bad thing that had made room for it. Denise let out a slow breath. I would want a lawyer to review anything before I sign, she said. And there it was again, not distrust exactly, but hard-earned wisdom. Jonathan nodded immediately. You should. And the company will pay for an attorney of your choosing who answers only to you. Denise stared at him for a second, then laughed once under her breath in disbelief. You really are not trying to make this easy for yourself. For the first time all morning, Jonathan smiled a little. It was brief, tired, and more human than polished. No, he said. I am trying to make it right enough to stand up to daylight. Naomi looked from one adult to the other and felt the atmosphere shift from survival into something stranger and softer. Possibility. It was not loud. It did not sparkle the way television promises did. It felt more like a locked window being opened 1 inch in a room that had needed air for years. The lounge door opened with a discreet knock, and Helen Brooks stepped in carrying a slim blue folder and 2 sealed envelopes. I did not want to interrupt, she said, though clearly she had judged the timing and chosen it on purpose. But there are updates you should have before the afternoon starts moving faster again. Jonathan rose partway in his chair. Go ahead. Helen handed 1 envelope to Denise. This confirms paid leave for the rest of the week with no loss of standing while legal review proceeds, and while you decide what, if anything, you want to do next. Denise took the envelope carefully, as if she were handling a document from a life adjacent to hers. Helen then placed the blue folder on the table in front of Jonathan. This contains the first draft of the educational trust structure, she said. Private. Independent. No publicity language. Finally, she looked at Naomi and offered the second sealed envelope to her. This one is yours. Naomi took it with both hands. The paper was heavier than the worksheets at school, creamy and stiff, with her name written on the front in dark blue ink. Naomi Carter. No title. No little girl from housekeeping. Just her name. What is it? She asked. Helen's expression, usually made of angles and control, warmed in a way Naomi had not seen before. Open it. Naomi carefully slid a finger under the flap and unfolded the letter inside. The words were typed, but one line at the bottom was written by hand. She read slowly, lips moving just a little on the harder words. It was a formal note from the board, thanking her for her honesty, her courage, and her presence of mind. But it was the handwritten line that made her stop. In firm dark ink, Arthur Bell had added, "Some people inherit titles. Some people earn respect before lunch." Denise let out a small sound that was almost a laugh and almost a cry. Jonathan read the line over Naomi's shoulder and lowered his head for a second, as if the truth of it landed somewhere private. Naomi looked back down at the letter. Earn respect before lunch. She did not know whether she felt proud or shy or overwhelmed. Mostly she felt full, in the way a room felt after too many windows had finally been opened. Helen looked at Jonathan. "There is one final update," she said. "Mercer has requested emergency contact through outside counsel. He wants to negotiate before regulators are notified." Jonathan's expression sharpened again, but it no longer carried the same cold distance as before. Now there was purpose in it, and something Naomi recognized from mothers more than executives. Protectiveness. "Then he knows the truth is ahead of him now, not behind him," Jonathan said. He turned back to Naomi, to the child who had changed the direction of the day by refusing to wait for permission to matter. "You asked me this morning if Richard was in trouble," he said. Naomi nodded. "Now I will tell you something else. Men like him count on time. They count on silence, confusion, delay, and the hope that by the time people understand what happened, the people responsible will already be gone." Naomi listened carefully. Jonathan's voice was gentle, but each word felt laid down with intention. "Today," he said, "you took time away from them." Naomi looked at the letter in her hand, then at the worksheet in her lap, then out through the bright windows at the river moving steadily below. The morning had started with a printer jam, a crumpled page, and her own small voice cutting across a hallway built for important men. Now the company's founder sat across from her talking about futures, truth, and things no longer being allowed to disappear. Denise reached over and squeezed her hand, the same way she had in the conference room, but this time the squeeze felt different. Not hold on. More like hold this. Hold what happened. Hold what it means. Jonathan rose slowly from the chair. "Take your time," he said. "No one is rushing you now." Then he looked once more at the word written on Naomi's fractions sheet. Scene. When he met Denise's eyes again, his voice dropped lower, almost like a vow spoken in an ordinary room. "Before this day ends," he said, "I intend to make sure the rest of the building understands what that word is supposed to mean." By late afternoon, the executive floor looked the same to anyone passing through from the outside. The glass still shone. The elevators still opened with their quiet silver sigh. Assistants still carried tablets and coffee cups and careful expressions. But Naomi had learned something important about buildings that day. Sometimes the biggest changes happened without moving a single wall. Sometimes a place looked untouched right up until the moment it began telling the truth about itself. The lounge door opened one last time just after 3 o'clock, and Jonathan Hale stepped in with no folder in his hands and no one behind him. The absence of an audience made the moment feel different immediately. He was not here as chief executive, not exactly. Not with legal counsel, not with board language, not with a room to manage. He was here as the man who had almost walked into a trap because he trusted the wrong things and overlooked the right ones. Denise stood slowly, but this time she did not look afraid. Tired, yes. Overwhelmed, yes. But not afraid. Naomi remained seated for a second longer, her fractions worksheet, and letter resting in her lap, until Jonathan smiled very slightly and said, "You do not have to stand for me, Naomi." So she did not. She stayed where she was, small in the gray chair, worn sneakers not quite touching the floor, and somehow that felt like the final proof that the day had changed. Jonathan crossed the room and stopped near the window. The river beyond the glass had gone from white noon glare to a softer gray-blue now, and the sun slanted lower across the water like a hand smoothing the day toward evening. "The board session is over," he said. "External counsel is in motion. Mercer's attorneys are talking faster than they were 2 hours ago. Internal review notices are going out building-wide before close of business. And before anyone asks, yes, the language includes staff treatment, reporting access, and executive accountability. Denise let out a slow breath. You really did it. Jonathan looked at her. No, he said. Your daughter did the hardest part. I am just the one who is no longer allowed to look away from it. Naomi studied him carefully. He still looked like a billionaire. You could not unbillionaire a man with one hard day. The tailoring, the watch, the posture, the weight of people listening when he spoke, all of that remained. But there was something else now, something less polished and more difficult. Humility did not make him smaller. It made him finally seem real. Jonathan walked over to the low table and set down a final envelope beside the others. This is a copy of the Culture Review Mandate, he said to Denise. Not because I expect you to read legal language for fun after a day like this. Because I want you to know this part is not being handled behind curtains. The review will include service staff interviews, anonymous reporting audits, promotion track patterns, and executive floor conduct. Denise stared at the envelope for a moment. You are opening the whole building. Jonathan nodded once. I should have done it years ago. Naomi looked up at him. Why didn't you? The question arrived the way children's questions often did. No warning. No cushion. Just the center of it. Denise turned toward her daughter with mild alarm, but Jonathan raised a hand very slightly, not to stop Naomi, but to stop anyone from stopping her. He took a breath before answering. Because success can make people confuse motion with vision, he said. I was running a company, building labs, chasing approvals, protecting growth. I thought that if the numbers were strong and the science was honest, then the rest of the structure must be healthy too. He glanced toward the glass wall, where the fading light reflected his own face back at him in pieces. That was not wisdom. That was comfort. Naomi thought about that. Comfort. She understood that word. Comfort was assuming a room was safe because it looked clean. Comfort was adults believing what was in the top pages because nobody wanted to read the gray appendix. Comfort was people walking past her mother every morning and calling it normal because they had done it before. Denise's eyes had softened as she listened, but they remained sharp too. She had spent too much of life around apologies that were really requests to move on quickly. This was not that. Jonathan's words did not ask her to relieve him. They asked him to live with what he had finally seen. There is one more thing, he said, reaching into his shirt pocket again. Naomi almost smiled at that. All the important things today seemed to come from envelopes or pockets or folded sheets of paper. This time he pulled out a small laminated badge on a navy lanyard. It was simple, temporary, the kind visitors wore. But the printed line beneath the company logo made Naomi blink. Naomi Carter, Honorary Truth Auditor. She looked up so quickly that Jonathan laughed once under his breath, quiet and tired and real. It is not a real corporate role, he said. Helen would refuse to put that on an organization chart. But I had the print desk make it anyway. Naomi took it carefully. The plastic was cool against her fingers. Denise looked at the badge, then at Jonathan, and shook her head in disbelief that had finally made room for warmth. Honorary Truth Auditor, she repeated. I could not exactly call her assistant to the chief executive, Jonathan said. Naomi let the lanyard drape over her hands. She liked the weight of it more than she expected. Not because it made her important in the way adults meant important, but because it felt like a joke built on respect instead of dismissal. A child could tell the difference. Jonathan crouched then, once more bringing himself level with her, and the late light through the windows caught at the edge of his shirt cuff and the silver in his watch in a way that no longer looked cold. Naomi, he said, this morning I almost walked past you. She held the badge still. I know. He nodded. You stopped me anyway. Naomi thought about the hallway, the sharp shoes, the cold lights, the page in her hand. I was scared, she admitted. Jonathan did not look surprised. Courage usually is. Denise's hand came to rest lightly at the back of Naomi's chair. Jonathan continued, his voice low enough now that the room seemed to lean in around it. When I first heard you speak, I saw interruption. Then I saw risk. Then I saw evidence. But somewhere between the hallway and now, I realized what I should have seen first. Naomi waited. Jonathan's eyes held hers, steady and unguarded. A person telling the truth does not become smaller because the room is large. Denise looked away for a second, not because she disagreed, but because some sentences struck too close to old bruises to be met head-on. Naomi lowered her eyes to the laminated badge in her hands, then to the worksheet on her lap, with the word seen written above the purple star. The room had gone very still again, But this final stillness felt warm. Earned. Outside, the sun slid lower behind the buildings across the river, and the windows caught a softer gold now instead of silver. Jonathan stood and walked to the lounge door, then stopped and looked back at them one last time. "My car is waiting downstairs," he said. Denise immediately shook her head. "That is not necessary." "I know," he said. "That is why I am offering." Denise looked at Naomi, then at the card, the folder, the letter, the badge, the whole impossible collection of proof that today had happened and not dissolved into rumor. Finally she nodded. "All right." Jonathan opened the door and waited, not stepping through first. Denise noticed. So did Naomi. He was holding the door. Not for a board member. Not for an investor. Not for someone who could do something for him. For them. Denise rose and gathered the folder and envelopes. Naomi slipped the worksheet, the letter, and the little badge carefully into her backpack. Then she slid off the chair and stood in front of Jonathan for one small second. The hallway beyond him was quieter now, washed in late light, the polished floor reflecting warm gold instead of cold white. Naomi looked up at him and said the thing she had been turning over in her mind since the lounge first went still around them. "You were going to trust the room," she said. Jonathan gave a faint, rueful smile. "Yes." Naomi tightened one hand on her backpack strap. "Next time, trust the people who clean it too." The words were simple, child-sized, clear as glass. Jonathan's expression changed in a way she knew she would remember when she was older. Not because he looked ashamed now, though he did. Not because he looked grateful, though he did. But because for the first time all day, he looked taut. He placed one hand over his heart, not theatrically, just once, like a man receiving a truth he intended to keep. "I will," he said. Denise stepped through the doorway beside Naomi, and Jonathan held it for both of them as the three of them moved into the glowing corridor together. Down at the far end, someone had switched on the evening lights, and the glass walls reflected soft gold, dark suits, cleaning carts, and one small girl in worn white sneakers walking between them with her head up. No one rushed her now. No one looked through her. The building was still the same building. The city was still the same city. But as the elevator doors opened and Jonathan stood back to let Denise and Naomi enter first, the quiet carried a truth that had not lived there that morning. She had not changed the whole world. She had changed one room, one man, one system beginning to wake up. And for one long shining second, that was enough.